Okay, I should think we could start because it's just turned 8 o'clock. So good evening to those of you that have joined over the last few minutes. I can't see you, but hopefully you can see and more importantly hear me. I'm Paul Starkey, I'm the Astini Chair, and welcome to the last lecture in this spring Astini Spring Lecture Series 2021. Our speaker today is Dr. Gemma Masson, and I don't need to spell out the title of her talk because you can see it on the screen, but I'm bound to say it anyway. British Diplomatic Travellers in 18th Century Istanbul. Gemma Masson is by far the most important person in Astini because she is the treasurer. She holds a PhD in Ottoman Studies from Birmingham University for a thesis entitled The Urban Janissary in 18th Century Istanbul. And at present, she's assistant editor of the Journal of Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations, and associate fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and the reviews editor of Empire. She'll be speaking to us about British diplomatic travellers, as I've already said. She will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, can you please use the Q&A facility, which you'll find at the bottom, or most people will find it at the bottom of their screens, not the chat facility. Use the question and answer Q&A facility, and I'll be keeping an eye on the questions, and we can put a selection of them to Gemma at the end of her talk. So without further ado, I will hand over to Gemma for her presentation, British Diplomatic Travellers.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you everyone for sharing your evening with us. It means a lot that you are coming to the Astini talks, and we hope you've been enjoying them. So, as I said, I'm going to talk, if you haven't heard enough already, about British diplomatic travellers in 18th century Istanbul. The 18th century is a period of specific interest for me because I think it's a very unpredictable period, not just in the Ottoman Empire, but globally. There's a lot of things changing, and it's almost that transitional moment from what we may say is definitively early modern and then into a more 19th century industrializing world. But first of all, I want to give you a little bit of context for what's going on in the Ottoman Empire at this time. So I was going to say my PowerPoint isn't obeying me. So the 17th century, as per the traditional narrative of Ottoman history, the 17th century, or indeed 1566 onwards, has often been viewed as the start of the decline phase of the empire and a period of stagnation. However, historians now, we don't really agree on that concept. There's a lot of new scholarship around the narrative of empire where that's not really the way we like to see it anymore. However, the 17th century did see some military defeats, most notably twice attempting to take Vienna, once in 1570 and once in 1683. There were many institutional changes across the Ottoman Empire in political institutions, military institutions, religious institutions. Membership went up in a lot of places. And there was also an economic crisis at the time, leading to a widespread coinage debasement. And I think the final thing that really impacted the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century, right at the end of the century, was the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, and that has often been seen as a major turning point in Ottoman history. And that brings us quite nicely into 1700s and the 18th century, which is what I'm going to talk to you about. So the 18th century was marked by a shift towards less warfare and more trade and diplomacy. So hard power to soft power, if you want to think in those kind of theoretical terms. This led to more interaction with embassies and their members on the part of the Ottoman state and just the Ottoman people, and of course more interaction for members of the embassy with both the Ottoman domestic power structure and wider Ottoman society. So such interactions did exist and are well documented in earlier centuries, but it was the 1700s where we really see this huge uptick in material regarding diplomatic life specifically. This shift obviously brought a great number of Europeans to Istanbul in a diplomatic role as opposed to leisure or business, and it has led to some extensive collections of primary literature detailing the experiences and observations of these travellers. And one thing I want to make clear is that there is a temptation to be very rigid in our classification of who constitutes a diplomatic traveller and what constitutes a legitimate diplomatic source. So we might be very tempted to think it's only the ambassadors that are relevant to diplomatic history. It's only the official writings of ambassadors that are relevant to diplomatic history. And so historians could limit themselves to official dispatches, correspondence, and diaries of appointed ambassadors. However, in my opinion, the definition of a diplomatic traveller can and should be extended to include the family, the staff, and the whole retinue within an embassy's household. And it's this wider classification I'm talking about today, and I hope that my sources will be able to show you different facets of diplomatic life based on what position a person held in a diplomatic household. With that in mind, I've chosen to present three very different travellers here, all of whom came to Istanbul in the 18th century as part of three different diplomatic households. And what I really hope to highlight is that members of the diplomatic household still had an experience solely dictated by their diplomatic status. So while we may also classify them as traveling for work or, you know, women travelers and things like that, they really are diplomatic travelers as well, and we shouldn't be overlooking these sources and these people and their stories when we study diplomatic history. Secondly, I hope to illustrate that information on the diplomatic life in Istanbul can come, as I've said, from these wide sources and show all the different facets, even though they might not be immediately so obvious to historians as, well, let's just look at what the ambassadors have to say. So I'm going to talk a little bit about diplomatic history because I assume, I think many of us are well enough versed with travel history in general. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about diplomatic history before I begin on the case studies. So recent trends in diplomatic history have begun to move in this broadening direction I'm talking about, and this has been occasioned by the rise of the new diplomatic history, which advocates an interdisciplinary approach to the study of diplomacy. However, according to the scholar John Watkins in 2008, the focus of this new diplomatic history is very much on the modern era and was unable to accommodate studies of pre-19th century diplomacy. This is a point which is addressed by the Network for New Diplomatic History, which was founded in 2011. Their website clearly states that, and I quote, "Although most of our own work is in the modern era, we are open to scholars with any chronological and geographic expertise." End quote. So this is something which I believe will be remedied in its own time, as most historical trends do start out life being showcased within the specialisms of the founding scholars, and definitely sort of pushing back pre-19th century. Yeah, a lot of foundational historical theories, at least in my experience, do come from studies of the 19th century onwards. So pushing that back is sort of our work now. The importance of diplomatic history as a field of study was addressed in a 2009 back and forth in the Journal of American History. Thomas Zeiler wrote a piece called The Diplomatic History Bandwagon, in which he argues that the presence of the state is central to any study of history. This was contradicted by Jessica Gienel-Hecht in her rebuttal, What Bandwagon?, who is not convinced that state and power are necessarily the keys to good research in any field. She argues that while studying the power of the state is important, it should never be the exclusive domain of diplomatic history, and that new scholarship does and can open new areas of inquiry not shaped by the power of the state. So as someone who wrote a primarily social history based thesis and did do a chapter on power and authority, I can agree with her to that extent. And I applaud her position about keeping things less in a box and less elitist, but it is something which can be problematic to apply in the Ottoman case in terms of sources, because in my experience, the majority of primary sources to be found in the archives are created by the state and the state institutions. So this leads to a very top-down view of history, and historians do need to spend quite a bit of time reading between the lines of this archival material. Most recently, the new diplomatic history has been applied to the 18th century Ottoman Empire by Michael Talbot of the University of Greenwich. In his 2017 book, which originated in his doctoral thesis, Talbot examines the practices of European diplomats in Istanbul, and he places at the centre of his work the interconnectivity of law and finance in diplomatic practice. This is no surprise because the British Embassy in Istanbul was somewhat unique, being under the sponsorship of the East India Company. And just as an aside, go and read Michael's book if you'd like a really deep dive into this. It's a fantastic book, and I could be tempted to just regurgitate it verbatim, but I won't. I really want you to go and read it. It is a fantastic work. So the East India Company, being very influential in the installing of British ambassadors, instilled in ambassadors the necessity of protecting British trade and commercial interests. The question of the ambassador being an agent of the crown versus the agent of the company is something which did cause contention between monarchs and merchants. And what most immediately comes to mind is a entry in the calendar of state papers Domestic from the 17th century, I believe under Charles I. He commented that he did not like the company assuming that their chosen candidate, who was on this occasion Sir Thomas Roe, would be appointed, but that's Charles trying to assert his own royal authority, and Charles I being very divine right of kings, I am the supreme power. It is in character, let's say that at least. Talbot looks at the capitulations granted to British merchants in his work, and he tries to see if they can be differentiated from those granted to the French or the Dutch, and he does see no discernible differences. Regardless, the protection and maintenance of these rights was always considered paramount for the British ambassadors. So the Ottomans, for their part, had what has been viewed as an unconventional approach to diplomacy. The first Ottoman ambassador was resident in London only in 1793, and in general, the Ottomans did not recognise the equality of other sovereigns. This unilateral model of integration was a power move, and the ambassadors can be seen as political hostages. There was a tendency to imprison rather than exile foreign diplomats in times of trouble, and this harkens back to the 15th century when the Ottomans took the sons of a rebellious regional prince in assurance for their father's good behaviour. And I think most people have heard of one of these boys. Yes, we know this guy, Vlad Dracula, because if you know me, you know I will find a way to work him into anything I do. We know him as Vlad the Impaler. He was a political hostage at the Ottoman court of Murad II, who was the father of Mehmed the Conqueror, and he was actually a classmate of Mehmed the Conqueror, as was his younger brother Radu. So that's just my little Dracula moment for this talk. Regardless, G.R. Berridge, writing on Ottoman diplomacy, has argued that the Ottoman Empire was actually fully integrated before the end of the 18th century, though the absence of Ottoman ambassadors overseas, I think, makes this interpretation somewhat problematic. There is a definite imbalance of power there. This suited the Ottomans because, as I've mentioned, they liked the leverage it gave them, and ironically, the Europeans were quite happy with this status as well, as long as they were granted the rights that they sought. The English Secretary of State especially often preferred to conduct negotiations via diplomats in foreign capitals, and this came to be called in some circles the English Plan, and thus broadened the political responsibility of British ambassadors. Regarding the European diplomatic situation in Istanbul at this time, the English diplomatic experience largely consisted of opposing French influence. France enjoyed long-standing good relations with the Ottomans and was the historical enemy of Britain. However, throughout the 18th century, the Ottomans grew increasingly suspicious of French political motivations, which did make opposing French influence easier for British diplomats. Coupled with the British-Turkish alliance of 1799 to expel France from Egypt and the British role as mediator in that instance, it appeared that Britain was gradually assuming the role of France as protector of the Ottomans. The very real danger that Britain feared, and I believe the Ottomans as well, was that French diplomacy could be used to export the French Revolution to the East, which was something no European power would want, and the Ottomans were a useful ally, would be a useful ally against the French Republic. And I have often thought for a long time that European powers did use the Ottoman Empire as a political battleground where they could sort of have it out with each other, as well as working on their own relations with the Ottomans. However, let's get on to our three travellers of the day. Excuse me. My first traveller is an ambassador whose dispatches focus greatly upon the international relations of other nations with each other and the Ottomans. Sir Robert Sutton, born 1671 to 72, was educated at Trinity College in 1688 and at the Middle Temple in 1691. 1691 also saw Sutton inherit property upon the death of his father. However, he was far from wealthy, and so he went in for a church career, becoming a deacon and then chaplain to his cousin, and travelled with his cousin when he became ambassador to Vienna, and that was in 1694. He abandoned his church career upon his appointment as secretary to the embassy in Vienna. He went on to become a career diplomat and politician, and was appointed to Istanbul in the early 18th century, serving in the post from 1702 to 1717. He was knighted a year before his arrival in Istanbul, and he served with distinction by all accounts. His writings have gone down in history for their accuracy and their acute analytical prowess. He was often praised by his superiors for how shrewd his insights on the current situations were. Sutton was aided in his work by being something of a polyglot. He was skilled in both Latin and Italian, both of which were key languages of diplomacy at the time. In 1717, he was appointed as mediator to the Austro-Turkish peace, a duty which he dispatched efficiently and ably. He was duly rewarded with his final diplomatic posting being the much coveted Paris appointment. Returning to England, he worked his way up the political ranks, married, and was appointed to the Privy Council. However, his career was not to be spotless. You see, I mention a scandal on the PowerPoint. In 1725, the same year he became KCB, he was also on the committee of the Charitable Corporation, which led to a 1732 scandal. And it's a sign of how prominent this scandal was that in 1733, the printers T. Warner at the Black Boy in Paternoster Row published a pamphlet entitled An Apology for Sir Robert Sutton. From then on, he maintained a muted political career following his fall from grace, and he died in 1746. So for this paper, I have been using the Despatches of Sutton as prepared by Professor Akdesh Kurat for the Camden series of the Royal Historical Society. So what do they tell us? Well, in his introduction to the papers, Professor Kurat defines Sutton as not being pro-Turkish and claims he was somewhat inclined to present a more unfavourable picture of the Turks than was actually true. Considering the fact that Sutton received his salary through the company and that salary was not always consistent, it's likely that some frustration with his circumstances made him grumpy. That resentment could have bled over into his work. So let's just give Robert Sutton a Snickers and get on with it. However, his income was supplemented by money paid to him by the Russian Tsar in exchange for his mediation between Russia and the Ottoman Porte. A great deal of Sutton's writing concerns not only British relations with the Ottomans, but relations of everyone else as well. In 1710, he dedicates a great deal of time and space to discussing the movements of the King of Sweden. Charles XII of Sweden was at this time in exile, being hosted at the Ottoman court after the fall of his empire in 1709 to Russia. The then Ottoman Valide Sultan, or the Queen Mother, convinced her son Ahmed III into war with Russia on behalf of Charles, and this led to the Pruth River Campaign of 1710-11, and you can see a map of said campaign up there. So this, as well as the mediating role of the ambassadors, is borne out in Sutton's writing of the 8th of December 1710. He describes a meeting with the Ottoman Sultan, and Ahmed seems to have expected Sutton to be presenting proposals on behalf of the Muscovites. When this proved not to be the case, the Sultan then felt free to express his frustration with the Russians and the intention of the Ottomans to engage them. So this suggests a certain level of confidence between the Sultan and Sir Robert. Sutton takes great pains to describe the individual players of these games and the tension between them, and he's nothing if not diligent in his writing. He actually apologizes for a delay when in sending his dispatches when he has been ill. He also apologizes when he is unable to verify information he's sending because he does not have it firsthand from someone who was in the camp. These details show how importantly Robert Sutton took his role, and as a career diplomat, it's the kind of polish that it's not always present in the writing of lesser qualified ambassadors. Anyone with even a passing familiarity with European history will know that it is a truth universally acknowledged that a British ambassador must be in want of an excuse to needle the French. Sutton got his chance in September 1712 when he wrote to Lord Dartmouth of the futility of the French ambassador's efforts to persuade the Sultan to break his current alliances. As we have said, France was somewhat losing favour at the Ottoman court. Now, my second traveller probably needs very little introduction to Astinian members, but I shall introduce her to everyone else, is our Lady Mary Montague. She's a firm favourite with Astine. Born in May 1689 as Lady Mary Pierpoint, she enjoyed a comfortable upbringing and a fine education. She soon became a prolific writer, and given her family's the connection of women in her family to the Blue Stocking movement, we're not surprised. It was her marriage to Edward Wortley Montague in 1712 which eventually brought her to London and caused her to become part of intellectual society there. Many people whom she counted as friends also belonged to this group, and they were to be the recipients of her letters from Turkey. These include Alexander Pope and Abbé Conti, as well as several well-to-do ladies of the upper class. Her decision to accompany her husband on his embassy to Istanbul is a sign of her support of and loyalty to her husband. Edward had married Mary despite her lack of dowry, which left her feeling beholden to him for the rest of her life, and this could also explain her willingness to undertake such a long journey with him. Another plausible reason is somewhat a little less selfless. While she was suffering from smallpox in 1715, someone had circulated the satirical court eclogues she had penned from her experiences at court and her friendships with members. Disgrace at court had soon followed, because some people have no sense of humour. It's understandable that with the loss of her social circle, an extended sabbatical overseas was appealing to her. Whatever the reasons, Lady Mary certainly made the most of her experiences and sent home long letters describing her travels and keeping copies for later reworking into a travel book, so she always intended to make a publication from this. That was something which became very fashionable for lady travellers, and we see it right through the 19th century. We know our beloved Amelia Edwards as well as a very great lady travel writer. She educated herself in Turkish culture, passionately pursuing studies of languages, literature, religions, and social customs. During her time in Istanbul, which she refers to as Constantinople in her writings, she seems to have been determined to explore and absorb as much of the culture there as she could, and it's worth noting that it is described as Constantinople in contemporary writings because legally there wasn't a law passed making it Istanbul until I think it was in the early 20th century. There was a law passed where the Turkish post office would no longer deliver letters addressed to Constantinople. It had to be Istanbul. And there's also rather a cute song entitled Istanbul, Not Constantinople, which I strongly advise everyone to look up because it's very catchy. Okay. As a woman, Lady Mary was granted access that male travellers were not. She would visit with Ottoman ladies in the harem areas of their homes, for example. Though her best-known work, Life on the Golden Horn, presents her experiences in Istanbul in a very accessible manner, it is a very edited-down version of her complete writings. So with this in mind, I have been working from the more complete Turkish embassy letters as edited by Malcolm Jack, and they have been my source for today. So through these writings, we get a glimpse of the experience of a diplomatic wife, both the limitations and freedoms that she enjoyed. As I've said, Lady Mary was a prolific writer. She recorded every leg of her journey to and from Istanbul, as well as her time in the city itself. However, for the purposes of today, I shall confine myself to examples from her work, which take place only when she is in Istanbul. Lady Mary's first impressions of the city were somewhat closeted, as she states she has been so busy receiving welcoming visitors that she did not have time to explore as much as she would have liked. She writes to Abbe Conti on the 29th of May in 1717, "Our palace is in Pera, which is no more a suburb of Constantinople than Westminster is a suburb of London. All the ambassadors are lodged very near each other. One part of the house shows us the port, the city, and the Seraglio and the distant hills of Asia." A certain French author says that Constantinople is twice as large as Paris. Mr. Wortley is unwilling to own 'tis bigger than London, though I confess it appears to me to be so. So Lady Mary is warming to the new city right away, and she's still unaware of how restricted her access is. She tells of how they live in Pera, which is the well-known European side of Istanbul, among other Europeans, which was a clever way to both contain foreigners in the city and make them feel more comfortable surrounded by things that would be more familiar to them. However, she was determined to see more of the city, and see it she would. By donning Turkish dress, as we see in this painting here, Lady Mary found herself able to move around the city with a considerable degree of freedom and devoid of all harassment, for, as she says, they dare not be rude to a woman, particularly not a respectably dressed Turkish woman. She comments she finds the Turkish veil perfectly comfortable, and claims that if it was not, I would be content to endure some inconvenience to content a passion so powerful with me as curiosity. That curiosity results in detailed depictions of the city and its customs, which she sends to her friends in England. Often she highlights how the reality is unlike the rumours that they hear about the Ottomans. So while Lady Mary may have had preconceived notions from her Orientalist contemporaries, she is perfectly willing to explore and to verify things for herself and to learn new things and communicate them back. However, one thing she does acknowledge is that Ottoman women had very little independent use of public spaces, with the exception of women's bathhouses. Never want to miss an opportunity to experience Turkish culture, Lady Mary records that while she was attending a bathhouse, she had an opportunity to observe a Turkish bridal party arrive, and recounts the ceremonies which went on here in detail. She concludes her observations by saying, "You may believe me that the Turkish ladies have at least as much wit and civility, nay, liberty, as ladies amongst us." Turkish styles of dress and bathing were not the only customs Lady Mary found herself participating in. Observing Ottoman women and their families, she writes that the value of a woman is greatly enhanced by the number of children she has, and it seems to be customary for a woman to always be producing children. She writes to her friend Anne Thistlethwaite, in January 1718, that the French ambassadress is forced to comply with this fashion as well as myself. She has not been here much above a year, and has lain in once and is big again. It seems that the European women were looked down upon by the Ottoman population should they not be evidently producing children. Lady Mary gave birth to her daughter during her time in Istanbul. While Lady Mary's approach to large families was to ask how so many children can be supported, the Ottoman women told her that due to a high infant mortality rate, it's unlikely that most would survive into adulthood, so a large number of children was necessary. This is one Turkish custom Lady Mary does not believe she could easily adapt to, nor is the climate. She records on several occasions how, accustomed as she is to British weather, she finds the Ottoman heat sometimes overwhelming. It's not only admission into the company of Ottoman ladies Lady Mary gains, but she tells of how she had to petition to be able to go into St. Sophia, and this confuses her, why is there so much administrative work when she can walk into any mosque in the city, many of which she says please her better architecturally than St. Sophia did. Lady Mary also recounts crossing the Bosphorus and the delight she takes in the scenery as well as the stately homes that she visits. She describes in great detail the home of the late Grand Vizier, which she visited in 1718, and waxes lyrical about the beauty of the building and its decor. However, nothing lasts forever, and in May 1718, Lady Mary writes that she is now preparing to leave Constantinople, and perhaps you will accuse me of hypocrisy when I tell you 'tis with regret, but I am used to the air and have learned the language. I am easy here. So for the negatives that she highlights of being a woman in Turkish society, she is still sorry to go. Now, her experience was undoubtedly very different to that of native Ottoman women, so we have to consider that. She would have the protection that being a foreign woman of the upper classes would give her, as well as the protection of being part of a diplomatic mission. Upon her return to England, she did longingly write that I must be contented with our scanty allowance of daylight, that I may forget the enlivening sun of Constantinople. That same sun that she complained she often found difficult to bear became an object of desire for her once she no longer had it, and she clearly remembers her time in Istanbul with great nostalgia. And that's a lovely thing, and it gives itself to a beautiful style of writing. But let's remember she's probably being very nostalgic and very rose-coloured glasses about some things. But if British diplomatic wives is a topic you're interested in, then I definitely recommend Katie Hickman's book, Daughters of Britannia. It's a fantastic starting point, and Katie Hickman was herself a diplomatic child and travelled around with her father's retinue. So she's writing from experience. I'm just giving you all the book recommendations today. So on to my final source. Sips cunningly. This is designed to give us a working man's view of diplomatic life in the 18th century. George Hay, the 8th Earl of Kinnoll, served as British ambassador to Istanbul from 1729 to 1736, but it is not Lord Kinnoll's account which interests me, but that of his butler, Mr. Samuel Medley. A devout Baptist, Medley was described by his great-grandson as a man of lively wit, sound understanding, great penetration, and unaffected piety. He seems to have been known for his cheerful disposition and the strong religious faith he bore, and he was said to end his days in Pontefract. So, Samuel Medley's diary came to my attention upon reading this book, The Earl and His Butler in Constantinople, which essentially tells the story of the embassy from Medley's point of view and is based upon the diary of Mr. Samuel Medley, which was found by his descendants and transcribed. The diary begins as follows. Oh, sorry, there's the coat of arms of the Earl of Kinnoll, because I could not find a painting of him for love nor money. So this is the family that Mr. Samuel Medley is serving. So the very first entry in his book is this, quote, a journal begun this 16th day of October 1733, Tuesday, being the day that completes 4 years since I came on board Mr. Adam's sloop at Wapping New Stairs and entered into the retinue of His Excellence, the Earl of Kinnoll, as his storekeeper and chief butler, but at this time groom of the chambers. And I have kept Medley's original spelling because I think it adds character to the writing. The diary shows that Medley did very well in the Earl's service, although it only covers the year 1733 to 1736. The full text of the diary was made freely available online at the Legini Press website after the publication of Nigel and Caroline Webb's book, although I looked recently and the website doesn't seem to be there anymore, so I'm very happy I acquired that transcription when I did. It's more of a day book than an actual diary per se. The volume does not contain long passages expounding upon the thoughts and feelings of the writer, but short daily entries detailing activities undertaken or something observed that day. Appropriate to his station in service, Medley maintains absolute discretion when talking about his superiors, which does not really help us as historians, but does give us an insight into his own views of propriety. Common musings he records are observations on the weather, noting who Lord Kinnour had dined with and or visited, who attends church, and what he buys at the market. He will note which areas of the city he walks to on a given day, and sometimes mentions something seen along the way, like the body of an executed criminal was one observation, and on another occasion he sees a set of dervishes dancing in the street. He also seems to maintain friendships with a number of other servants and local tradesmen, people he mentions doing business with, going walking with, and dining with. He makes small mentions of politics, such as, "We received good news today," presumably his lord had told him it was good news. There are occasional small household dramas, like a fire in the chimney which was quickly put out, right alongside overheard news of politics or military matters. So those nice little domestic dramas alongside the diplomacy that Lord Kinnour's engaged in. Medley seems reluctant to record where he gets his news from, and he doesn't specify who tells him something, whether it is from a newspaper, from the marketplace, or from servants' hall gossip. Another perennial theme throughout the journal is his own health. Samuel Medley seems to have been either a hypochondriac or very prone to the illnesses of the day, particularly gout. Whenever he was recovering from gout, he was quick to give God credit by stating, "Better in my foot, BBMG." Now, BBMG is something, the abbreviations found in the diary are a little blurred here, but you see, BBMG is "Blessed be my good God." So he comes up with his own sort of versions of shorthand, which have been very helpfully decoded for us here. As we have said, Medley is a God-fearing man, and he does spend quite a bit of time at church or at the English burial ground in Istanbul. But his observations of other denominations leave something to be desired, as he seems unable to distinguish between Greek Orthodox religious practices and what he terms popery. As a Baptist, possibly Presbyterian, I think he sees it all as a little bit idolatrous, but yes, he really does not distinguish between Roman Catholicism or Greek Orthodox. But I do recommend Nigel and Caroline's book if you're looking for a detailed breakdown and classification of Medley's diary. The impression is very much of a world within a world, that the experience within the diplomatic household was at the same time unique to their situation, but still integrated in many ways into the fabric of Istanbul life. This blurred line of a separate but also an integral sphere of life, whereby it's something which applies to many institutions in Ottoman history. Mostly I've seen it in the Janissary Corps of the 18th century, but you see it really throughout the whole urban life of Istanbul especially. So from our three travellers here, I believe we can come to the consensus that diplomatic travellers, regardless of gender or social rank, all still underwent a very curated experience, either by their own inclinations or by design of the diplomatic system. However, the experiences of these travellers of the 18th century are more opened up to wider Ottoman society than they had been in centuries previously. The best example of a previous writing would be the letters of Buzbek. He is and was often cited with very little critical thinking in a lot of places. In reality, he spent a lot of his time, if not exactly under house arrest, then certainly being very strictly managed by the Ottomans when he was there. So he saw what he was supposed to see and no more. Compare that to our 18th century travellers, there is a much more expanded horizon and a freer flow of information. Lady Mary is able to don this Turkish dress and go to the bathhouse. Samuel Medley is able to, walk to market through all the districts of Istanbul and go and dine out with his friends, which, well, 18th century Istanbul, quite like 18th century London, actually did have a strong coffee house culture. And there would be that sort of intellectual environment was there also. So this reflects this broadening freedom does reflect a gradual shift towards a more active use of diplomacy throughout the 1700s, as we mentioned earlier. And this new openness allows travellers from this point onwards to not only describe more of the society in which they found themselves, but also to be increasingly more accurate in their accounts as time goes on. To me, this definitely sets up the 1700s as a critical period in Ottoman Europe diplomatic history. And I really want to see more interdisciplinary studies which meld diplomatic history with the history of travel. And I'd love to see some more of that in the future. We need to see diplomats not only as part of political history, but also as part of the history of travel, and make space for their unique experiences within the field of travel history. That's not to say that these writings have not been studied before. They have. Women's history, social history, political history. I'm all in favour of blending things together. There can be a Venn diagram where these sources intersect, and that point of intersection could bear closer scrutiny from historians, in my humble opinion. So that's what I want to see open up more in the future. And I definitely think regarding diplomatic history, we need to see beyond the narratives of the ambassadors alone, and also incorporate those who observed them, like Samuel Medley, and who lived and interacted with them as well, in order to gain a fuller and more holistic image of diplomatic history at that time. So I will wrap up by thanking you all for coming and reminding you that the Astine Summer Online Conference call for papers is out. Details should be on your screen now. Our deadline is the 30th of April. Please visit our website or our social media for more details. And I would very much like to have a discussion with you about anything you like, but probably what I've been talking about, I hope. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Gemma, for a most interesting lecture. A couple of questions have come up.
Okay.
So can I put one or two to you? The first one is from Jennifer Lawton.
Oh, okay.
I was interested to see that Samuel Medley's diary was described as secret in the subtitle of the book. Was keeping a diary a secret act for someone in Medley's position? Should he not have kept the diary, or is this just a selling point by the authors of the subsequent book?
I think a little bit of, I think it's a selling point. Obviously, he rose to a status within the household of, you know, being someone who had to keep records, managing the stores and whatnot. So it wouldn't be so unexpected that he'd be literate. But I think they called it secret because they'd only just discovered it. Sort of no one had known about it until they dug it up in some old family archive. So it had been almost sort of a secret that it existed until they found it. But it definitely helps the selling point of the book.
Okay. A question from somebody called Yvonne Masson, who I guess might be related to you.
That's my mother-in-law. Hello, Mum. Hi, Mum.
What appropriate church could Medley have attended in Istanbul?
Oh goodness me, there were religious history of Istanbul and Constantinople. Goodness me, no, there were many churches, often set up to service ambassadors and merchants, and a lot of the embassies did have their own chaplains. I think that I mentioned that Robert Sutton was a chaplain to his cousin's embassy. So yes, there were churches there. I can't think of the one specific church Medley would have attended, but yes, they did exist. So
can I put a follow-up question to that? You mentioned that he had some difficulty sort of sorting out the Roman Catholics from the Orthodox.
Yes.
Did he actually make any comments or say anything interesting about Islam?
I mean, nothing immediately springs to mind. He almost doesn't sort of engage with it. I think he's very much, into himself. He's very much, it's very kind of upstairs, downstairs, very you rang my lord kind of thing. He's very much in his own little world. I mean, for someone who can barely comprehend the difference, I mean, all he says is he calls it a popery, but in a very disparaging manner. So whether he's using that as a blanket term for all kind of what he perceives as idolatry, or he really thinks it is Catholic, it's not clear. I say he's not particularly verbose. He doesn't expound with very long explanations at all, but I think he very much seems to socialize within his own comfort zone. So I shouldn't think he has too much interaction, to be frank.
Yeah. Something from Malcolm Wagstaff, a comment or question relating to something that you mentioned very early in your presentation. You mentioned the East India Company.
Yeah.
Was it really the East India Company or the Levant Company?
I mean, I've read sources where they use both interchangeably. I think it depends what time period you're talking about. I mean, like I say, I've read sources that use both, sometimes use it interchangeably. I mean, I think the Levant Company, the East India Company, I mean, it could be, but yeah, I'm going to have to plead specifics on that one. He's probably right, but
further research. Yeah, something from Jack Dijkstra McCarthy. Yeah. Your travellers mentioned dress, heat, food and ill health, to name just a few. Do you think incorporating a cross-cultural sensory history would add further value? Perhaps as performance has been brought into the new diplomatic history.
No, I mean, it's interesting because I do have friends and colleagues, some of whom might be here, who actually work on sort of like smells and the history of scent and things like that. So I'm definitely not discounting it. I think cross-cultural sensory history, I like the way that sounds. I definitely think, that could be, I mean, there could be something there. I wouldn't discount it. That's actually quite a nice idea.
Keep you going for a decade or more, I would think, probably.
Yes, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that statement. You know, cross-cultural sensory history. There's plenty to keep you busy.
Something from Michael Talbot.
Oh, Michael's here.
Of the sources well, there are two questions really. First, of the sources you've examined this evening, do you have a favourite and why? And secondly, you've done work on Janissary culture in this period. Have you found any instances where these two projects have intersected, i.e. Janissaries and Brits meeting and or writing about each other? That's a very interesting question.
Okay, first of all, hello, Michael. I promise I didn't know you were here, and I was bigging up your book in a completely genuine manner because I really enjoyed it. Of the sources I've examined this evening, do I have a favourite? I know. I mean, there's a lot being done already around sort of Robert Sutton and Lady Mary. I kind of like Samuel Medley because he just seems to be this very kind of unassuming, this very sort of British stiff upper lips who's just been dropped into this situation, and he just sort of carries on and flourishes in it. And maybe that's just my brain being very sort of history from below oriented, but yeah, so I think out of my three tonight, it's probably, I'd say Medley, also because there's not that much about him. There's literally just the book and his diary, and that's it. So I'd kind of love to see him a bit more referenced and a bit more known. So he's my underdog of the evening. So Janissaries and Brits meeting and or writing about each other. Well, what I did not mention, because I didn't want to push for time, is that Lady Mary has a very interesting incident with a Janissary, where she wanted pigeons for her supper, and there wasn't any to be had from the merchant, and the Janissary, she says, in his zeal for my service, had brought the local Abkadi to her when he discovered that there was no pigeons to be had, and said, you know, he says there's no pigeons for you, should I cut off his head? And she's like, no, don't do that. But yes, the Brits would have had interaction with the Janissaries, particularly those assigned as ambassadors. Well, not as ambassadors, two ambassadors as bodyguards. It was a very it could be a lucrative position for Janissaries, but I think a lot of people, well, it could be lucrative, it could also be unpopular. So they had to wear, I believe, distinctive yellow shoes, which marked them out as being assigned to embassy duty. And I have heard that the other Janissaries might call them swine herds, because, you know, they were herding the European swine, as it were. So yes, I think Europeans would have had that kind of interaction. And also Medley, when he comments on the body of an executed criminal, that's actually a Janissary that has been hung for something or another. I'm not entirely sure what, but it's an executed Janissary. So given how present they are in the urban life of 18th century Istanbul, I'd imagine that you can't really get away from them. The question is whether or not these Brits knew they were interacting with Janissaries, because, you know, they wore several hats. They didn't have to be wearing their Janissary hat necessarily. You know, they could be a Janissary and a butcher and a, you know, person in the coffee house and this and that. So, you know, Janissary identity was not just one thing or the other at that time. So I think, yes, we have some accounts of British Janissary interactions, but there was also probably many that either went unrecorded or where the European just didn't know they were dealing with a Janissary, particularly in the 18th century. But if I dive into Janissary identity, I'll regurgitate my whole thesis at you, so I won't do that. But yes, I hope that answers Michael's question.
A question from Robert James. He actually asked one of the previous questions, so I got a bit mixed up on the screen, but never mind. He's got another question. Mary Montague's accounts appear to suggest that she was being very judgmental of Ottoman women. Was this part of the othering of different cultures common among Europeans at the time?
I mean, I don't think she's critical of Ottoman women. I think she was critical of the restrictions placed on them, that they seem to consider perfectly normal. Obviously, to her, this wasn't perfectly normal. To spend your entire life pregnant was not something that, you know, she didn't want to do. I think I don't think Mary is actually deliberately negative. I think her reactions are very much shaped by her own context, where it's all very new to her. I mean, the othering of different cultures, she is a little more accurate than other writings, so I don't think so. But obviously, you know, there was this huge sort of love of all things Turkish. You know, she had her image, her painting done in Turkish dress, for example, and in fact a lot of Europeans did at the time. It was considered somewhat fashionable. So yeah, I don't think I mean, it could be taken as othering, but I don't think she was doing that deliberately. I think she was just being very genuine and immediate in her reactions to it. If that helps.
Fair enough. We've still got a few questions coming in. We're going to have to be a bit selective and draw things to a close in a bit, but we've got time for 2 or 3 more, I think.
Okay.
The first one is from Patrick Hart, which is an interesting question. Could you say a little more about the matter of language? You mentioned that Sir Robert Sutton was a polyglot, knew Latin and Italian. Did he or the others you discussed learn Ottoman Turkish?
Oh, well, I know Lady Mary did, and she was told she was very good at it. How much that was being hospitable or not, I think it was one of the hobbies she picked up as a lady of leisure. I think, I mean, yes, they did have dragomans. There were, you know, very significant. I think pretty much every embassy would have them, and it was considered a good job to have in Ottoman society. So I'm not sure if Sutton ever learned Ottoman Turkish. I think he was more European language oriented because, as I said, he landed the very coveted Paris position. But yes, in terms of what role did dragomans play in the 18th century, they were everywhere. Sort of every embassy had them. They were like an extra limb for the ambassador. I think you wouldn't want to be without them.
Yeah. Was Sutton, Worsley and Kinnell all fortunate to serve during periods of generally cordial English-Ottoman relations?
I mean, I'd say so. I mean, I think they were fortunate to have been serving when they were. I mean, if you look into the 17th century and the Bendish Hyde affair, for example, yes, I'd say the 18th century was probably a good period to be a British diplomat in Istanbul. Yeah, I'd agree with that statement, Christopher. Yes.
Yeah, and did any of them recount visits to others? A factual question. And did any of them recount visits to other cities in the Ottoman Empire beyond Constantinople?
Yes, I tried to keep things strictly on a Constantinople thing, but actually Lady Mary, yes, she writes about, like I said, every leg of the journey to and from, and obviously in the 18th century that was a long journey, and they stopped places, they stayed with local dignitaries. So yes, there's a lot more to see in her letters. The others not so much, because as I say, Medley only started his diary a few years into his time in Istanbul, and Sutton, it's only his official Istanbul dispatches that I had. So
I think this next one probably the last question, but it touches on something that keeps coming up in Astini conferences and discussions.
yeah.
It's the matter of wearing local dress. From Brian E. Llewellyn, interesting to know that Lady Mary wore Turkish dress when she walked around Istanbul. Was her intention to just disguise herself or just not to attract too much attention? And as another example, Henrietta Liston, another diplomatic wife, decided not to do so, as she said that it was impossible to disguise the fact that she was a Frank.
Yeah, I mean, I think from what I remember of Henrietta Liston, she is a 19th century, so that's a little later. But no,
Yeah.
I think Lady Mary was just about having an experience, and wearing Turkish dress would be an experience. And yes, presumably she would have had a dragoman and she would have been escorted. I don't think she wouldn't have gone about alone for sure. I don't think she was disguising herself, but I think it was part of experiencing the local culture. And also she mentions that she enjoyed going into the mosques and looking at the mosques, so of course she would have had to be covered to go into the mosques, as ladies are in Istanbul to this day. We still cover when we go into mosques. So I think it was practicality and just for the experience of it.
Great. I think we probably need to draw this session to a close. Your voice must be quite.
I hope. Well, no, I hope I answered everyone's questions to a satisfactory degree.
I think excellent, a very interesting set of questions. So thank you very much to the audience as well as to Gemma. This brings to an end the last of our lectures in the Astini Spring Lecture Series. You've already got on your screen, it's still on your screen, the Astini Summer Online Conference on Saturday 24th and Sunday the 25th of July. Because of the COVID situation, we've had to postpone the live Bristol conference until July 2022, but we hope that we'll see you online in July 2021 and face-to-face next year. As well as the summer online conference, I can say we've got rather an experimental event during May. On the 15th of May, we have a postgraduate research competition, which is running again on Zoom between 11 o'clock and 4:45. More details on the website. So it's a warning, the website is being reconstructed at the moment, so not everything is totally up to date, but we're trying to put the essentials on as soon as possible. And then Well, the general feeling is that the spring series of lectures has been a considerable success, and we've had some very complimentary comments about them. So we'll be thinking of another series of lectures in the autumn. We haven't got dates yet, but keep your eyes peeled, and information about an autumn series of lectures will be available as soon as possible. So we can't see you, at least, but we can only see you metaphorically. We hope to see you metaphorically again at one or more of those events. So from myself, on behalf of Astini, and from Gemma, thank you for listening, and thank you for your contributions, and have a happy Easter, and hope to see you again soon.